The old Thesari grandmother clicked her mandibles 3 times before she spoke. That was always the warning. 3 clicks meant the story was serious. 3 clicks meant the children should stop moving and start listening. "Before I tell you this," she said, her 6 eyes scanning the young ones gathered around her, "you must understand one thing. Not everything that is forgotten is gone. Some things simply wait." The children leaned in closer. "Now," she said softly, "let me tell you about the humans." The galactic conclave had existed for over 4,000 years. It was not a perfect thing. It was loud and slow and full of arguments that lasted longer than some species had been alive. But it worked. More than 200 sapient species sat under its banner, and for all its noise, it had kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart for a very long time. Every species in the conclave had a history. Every species had wars behind them, and scars, and stories they told their young to explain how the universe worked. But there was one story, one name that crossed every border and every language without being asked to. Human. Nobody alive had ever seen one. That was the first strange thing. The second strange thing was that nobody could agree on what they were. The Vreth said they were monsters invented to scare soldiers who were getting too comfortable. The Alun, the ancient gas dwellers who had been around since before most species learned to write, said the humans were real but gone, dead, probably, like so many others who burned too bright and too fast. The Thesari did not say much. They only clicked their mandibles and looked at the stars, and kept their oldest records locked away in vaults that not even conclave officials were allowed to enter. The records existed, everyone knew that. Nobody pushed too hard to see them. In the conclave's grand chamber on the station called Verathsul, a session was underway. The chamber was a massive circular room with tiered seating that curved all the way up to a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. Hundreds of species sat in their designated sections. Translators hummed. Lights blinked in the corners where the live broadcast was being recorded for the rest of the galaxy to watch later. The topic was border disputes in the outer spur. It was, as most border disputes were, deeply boring. And then someone mentioned the word. It was a small delegate from a minor trading species called the Fenari. He was nervous, and he was trying to make a point about uncharted space, and he said, almost by accident, that some of his people's older navigational charts marked a certain region with a warning symbol, and that the symbol was the old code for human territory. The chamber went quiet. Then it erupted. Vale Kreth, High Commander of the Vreth Dominion, rose from his seat. He was large even by Vreth standards. His armor was black and polished. His eyes were the color of old copper, and they had never once, in his 40 years of military service, shown anything that could be called fear. "Are we truly doing this?" he said. His voice carried without effort. The chamber quieted again, not out of respect exactly, but because the Vreth Dominion had 700 warships and Vale Kreth was the one who decided where they pointed. "Every few years," he continued, "someone finds an old chart or an old story or a cave painting on some forgotten moon, and we spend 3 days talking about humans, creatures with no carapace, no venom, no hive mind, a lifespan so short it is almost insulting." He let that sit for a moment. "My soldiers tell their hatchlings about humans to make them behave. That is the appropriate level of seriousness we should give this topic." A few species laughed, several others did not. From the far left of the chamber, in the soft blue light that the Thesari preferred, Ambassador SSI Orin rose slowly. She was old. Her carapace had gone pale at the edges and her movements were careful, but her voice was steady. "High Commander," she said, "with respect, the Vreth Dominion is 400 years old. The Thesari have been keeping records for 3,000, and our records do not describe humans as a bedtime story." She paused. "They describe them as a species we met briefly and then lost contact with, a species that was, by every measure we had, remarkable." "Remarkable," Vale Kreth repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "In what way?" SSI Oren looked at him for a long moment, in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has never read the accounts, she said, and she sat back down. That night, or what passed for night on Varath Sol, since the station simply dimmed its lights on a schedule, SSI Oren sat alone in the Thessari delegation's private room and read from her personal archive. The records were old. Some of them were so old the formatting had degraded and parts of the text were missing. But the core of them was intact, and she had read them so many times that she could have recited large portions from memory. The first confirmed Thessari contact with a human vessel had occurred 312 years ago. A research ship called the Gentle Steppe had been doing survey work in an uncharted region, near what the charts now called the Orion Spur, when it encountered a vessel unlike anything in any known registry. The vessel was smaller than expected. It moved in ways that the Gentle Steppe's crew found confusing. Not erratic exactly, but different, like the pilot was thinking about movement in a way that didn't match how anyone else thought about it. The crew of the Gentle Steppe had been frightened. Their captain, a careful and experienced explorer named Thessarinal, had ordered them to hold position and begin translation protocols. What happened next was in the record, written in Thessarinal's own hand. The vessel responded immediately. Before our protocols were even finished, they were already trying to talk to us. Not with weapons, not with warnings, they were, and I'm not sure how else to write this, excited. They seemed genuinely happy to find us. One of them, who later told us his name was something we could not fully pronounce but who accepted the name Marco, spent 6 hours talking to our linguist. He asked questions constantly. He wanted to know everything. Where we were from, what we ate, whether we had music, whether our young were born live or hatched from eggs. He laughed a great deal. I did not always understand what was funny. SSI Oren had always loved that part. Before they left, Marco gave us a small object. He called it a relay beacon. He said if we ever wanted to talk again, we should activate it. He said his people would be listening. He said, and I wrote this down carefully because I wanted to make sure I had it right, we're not going anywhere. We're just hard to find. The Gentle Steppe had returned home. The beacon had been studied, catalogued, and eventually placed in a storage facility. Attempts to activate it over the following decades had produced no response. After 100 years, most people in the Thessari Science Council assumed it was broken, or that the humans were gone, or both. The beacon had been moved to a research outpost near the Orion Spur 30 years ago, partly for historical study, and partly because nobody quite wanted to throw it away. SSI Oren set down the archive and looked at the wall. She thought about what Vale Creth had said, no carapace, no venom, no hive mind. She thought about how Thessarinal had described Marco's eyes. He looked at everything like he was seeing it for the first time and couldn't believe his luck. She thought about the beacon, sitting in a research outpost, quiet for 300 years. She wondered, not for the first time, if quiet was the same as silent. The next morning, she received a message from the outpost. It was short. The researcher who sent it sounded like she was trying very hard to stay calm and not entirely succeeding. Ambassador, the beacon is active, something answered. SSI Oren read the message twice. Then she read it a third time. She sat very still for a long moment, the way Thessari sometimes did when their mind was moving very fast and their body needed to stay out of the way. Then she stood up, walked to her communication console, and sent a private message to the research vessel Endless Curiosity, which was currently the closest Thessari ship to the Orion Spur. She told them to go to the beacon. She told them to go carefully and quietly. She told them to bring a very good linguist. She did not tell the conclave. She did not tell Vale Creth. She told herself she would inform them soon, after she knew more, after she was sure. But the truth she admitted only to herself, in the quiet of her room, with the dim station lights casting soft blue shadows across the old records on her desk, was that she did not want anyone else in the room for this. 300 years. The galaxy had spent 300 years turning the humans into a story, a joke, a legend, something to argue about in chambers and laugh about at diplomatic dinners. And now, in a small outpost near the Orion Spur, the story had answered back. She looked at the old record again, at Thissaronal's words, at the line that had stayed with her for 20 years since she first read it. "We're not going anywhere, we're just hard to find." She turned off the light and sat in the dark, and listened to the faint hum of the station around her. Somewhere out there, past the edge of the known charts, past the unlit space where the old probes had stopped sending signals, something was waiting, something that had always been there, something that had, apparently, been watching the galaxy for a very long time. And it had finally decided to say hello. SSI Orin clicked her mandibles once. Not 3 times. This was not a warning. Just once, the way Thessari did when something settled into place, when a long question finally started moving toward its answer. Then she began to write her report. She started with a sentence she had been quietly composing in her head for years, against the small, stubborn hope that this day would come. To the Galactic Conclave, and to all species who have waited and wondered. They are real, they were always real, and they are close. The endless curiosity was not a warship. It was a research vessel, which meant it was built for patience rather than speed, and for carrying equipment rather than weapons. It had a crew of 22, a very large archive section, and a kitchen that the crew complained about constantly but secretly appreciated because the head cook, a young Thessari named Velisan, was quietly excellent at his job. The ship's chief xenobiologist was named SSI Theranal. She was the ambassador's niece, though she rarely mentioned it because she preferred people to think she had gotten her position through talent, which she had. She was precise, careful, and deeply curious about everything, qualities that served a xenobiologist well. She had spent 11 years studying species that the Conclave had already catalogued, and she had always quietly hoped that one day she would find something new. She had not imagined it would be this. The endless curiosity dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the coordinates her aunt had sent, near the edge of the Orion Spur, where the star maps got thin, and the notations mostly said things like unverified and survey incomplete, and in a few places, simply unknown. For a moment, the view screen showed nothing but stars, and the distant curve of a dust nebula that glowed faintly orange. Then the ship's detection system made a sound it had never made before, not an alarm exactly, more like a surprised chirp, and every screen on the bridge lit up with data. There was a vessel out there. It was not in any registry. It did not match any known configuration. It was roughly comparable in size to the Endless Curiosity, maybe a little longer, with a shape that was smooth and rounded in some places and angular in others in a way that felt slightly random, like the designers had made decisions based on what worked rather than what looked impressive. It was painted in 2 colors, a deep gray blue on most of the hull, with panels of warm white near the front. On the side, in large, clean lettering, were symbols that the ship's translation system chewed on for a few seconds before producing a tentative result. ISV pale blue. And below the name, a small circular image, blue and white swirls, a sphere, unmistakably a planet. SSI Theranal stood very still at her console. Her 6 secondary eyes, the small ones along her temples that usually tracked background information, had all turned toward the view screen on their own. Her main eyes hadn't blinked. "They're hailing us," said the communications officer, a young male named Athen, in a voice that sounded like he was reporting something perfectly routine while his entire body disagreed. "Open the channel," SSI Theranal said. The screen split. On one half the pale blue floated against the stars, on the other half a face. The first human that SSI Theranal ever saw was a woman of medium height with brown skin, dark hair pulled back from her face, and eyes the color of deep water. She was wearing a uniform, practical, not decorative, and she had an expression on her face that SSI Theranol would later spend a long time trying to describe accurately in her notes. The closest she got was the look of someone who has been waiting for a bus that is 300 years late and has just seen it coming around the corner. "Hello," the human said. Her voice was warm and even, and there was something underneath it, some current of feeling she was keeping very carefully controlled. "My name is Captain Alina Vasquez. I am from Earth." She paused. "I imagine you have some questions." The first 6 hours were a kind of controlled chaos. Both ships matched velocity and drifted alongside each other while their translation systems worked, compared notes, and worked some more. It turned out that the humans had been collecting Thesari language data for a long time. The translation from their end was, startlingly, almost perfect. From the Thesari side it was rougher, but it improved quickly. SSI Theranol asked the captain to confirm her species. "Human," Vasquez said. "We also call ourselves Homo sapiens, but that's mostly for formal occasions or arguments about biology." SSI Theranol wrote that down. She wrote down everything. "You answered the beacon," she said. "We did," Vasquez said. "We've been monitoring it for a while. When the Thesari moved it to the outpost near this sector, it came within range of one of our listening posts. We've been waiting to see if anyone would activate it." "It was activated by accident," SSI Theranol admitted. "A junior researcher knocked it off a shelf." There was a pause. Then Vasquez smiled. It was the first human smile SSI Theranol had ever seen in person, and she found it slightly alarming and somehow deeply reassuring at the same time. "We don't care," Vasquez said. "We're just glad it happened." The formal first contact meeting took place the next day, in a neutral space, a shared communications environment rather than aboard either ship, because both sides agreed that walking onto a stranger's vessel after 300 years of silence was perhaps moving a little fast. Vasquez brought 2 crew members with her to the virtual meeting. Her first officer, a tall, quiet man named Lieutenant Haro Chen, who seemed to communicate primarily through calm nods, and a young woman introduced as Specialist Danny Park, who was the ship's xenocommunications expert, and who had clearly been awake for about 30 hours, and was holding a cup of something hot and dark that she kept drinking from with the focused desperation of someone who needed it very badly. "What is that?" SSI Theranol asked, nodding toward the cup. "Coffee," Park said. It's a drink. It's made from roasted seeds. It has a chemical in it that helps humans stay alert." She paused. "Do you want some? I can synthesize a packet and send it over in a transfer pod." "Perhaps later," SSI Theranol said carefully. "Smart," said Chen. It was the first thing he had said. The questions came from both sides, fast and layered, and SSI Theranol's recording systems were running at full capacity. But the answers that mattered most, the answers that changed everything, came when SSI Theranol finally asked the question she had been building toward since the moment the screen came on. "The Conclave lost contact with your species 312 years ago," she said. "A probe malfunction. It was assumed by most that your world was gone." She paused. "What happened?" Vasquez set down the object she had been holding, a small flat rectangle that she occasionally looked at, which appeared to be a personal data device, and gave SSI Theranol her full attention. "The probe didn't malfunction," she said. "We turned it off." "Silence." "You turned it off," SSI Theranol repeated. We had been watching Conclave communications for a while by that point, long enough to understand some of the politics, long enough to see that the Vreth Dominion was getting very large and very aggressive, and that a newly discovered primitive species would probably look like an opportunity to them. Vasquez's voice stayed even. "We decided that disappearing was safer than introducing ourselves to a galaxy that might not be ready or safe for us yet." "So you hid," SSI Theranol said. "We observed," Vasquez said gently. "There's a difference." Over the next 2 days, the shape of what humanity had been doing for 3 centuries slowly became clear. It was, SSI Tharanal later wrote in her report, one of the most astonishing things she had ever learned. The humans had not gone quiet, they had gone busy. Using the probe technology as a starting point, they had spent decades building a network of long-range passive listening systems, hidden in asteroids, tucked inside nebulae, floating silent in the dark between stars. These systems listened. They did not broadcast. They collected data, communications, political movements, military deployments, trade routes, cultural shifts, from across the conclave and beyond, and they sent it all home in tight compressed bursts that nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking. For 300 years, Earth had been watching the galaxy the way a very patient student watches a very complicated classroom. They had learned 47 conclave languages. They had detailed records on every major species, every significant political event, every war and treaty and trade agreement that had occurred in the last 3 centuries. They knew the names of ships. They knew the names of admirals. They knew, Vasquez admitted with a slight smile, quite a lot about the Vreth Dominion specifically. How much? SSI Tharanal asked. Vasquez looked at Chen. Chen said enough. On the third day, SSI Tharanal transmitted her report to Ambassador SSI Oren, who transmitted it carefully, with significant context attached to the Galactic Conclave. The response was immediate and, in the way of the Conclave, extremely loud. Most species were stunned. Several demanded proof. Some of the smaller, more peaceful species, the gentle Alun, the quiet marsh dwellers of Pelith IV, responded with something close to joy, as if a rumor they had always hoped was true had just been confirmed. The Vreth Dominion's response arrived within hours, and it was not joyful. Veilkreth transmitted a formal statement to the conclave that was polite on the surface, and carried the weight of a threat underneath every sentence. He spoke of security concerns and unregistered vessels in unclaimed space, and the responsibility of the conclave to assess potential risks. He announced that a Dominion fleet would be dispatched to the Orion Spur to investigate. SSI Tharanal read the statement on her console and felt something cold move through her. She went to the communications channel and told Vasquez. The human captain read the statement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many ships is he sending?" The statement says a fleet. Based on Vreth standard deployment protocols, probably 30 to 50 vessels. Vasquez nodded slowly. She didn't look afraid. She looked thoughtful, like she was running through something in her head. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," SSI Tharanal said. "Captain, 40 Vreth warships are being sent to this location." "I know," Vasquez said. "We've been watching Vreth deployments for about 200 years. I have a reasonable idea of what they'll do when they get here." She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down with the mild disappointment of someone who had expected that and was still briefly sad about it. "Are you not concerned?" SSI Tharanal asked. Vasquez looked at her. There was something in her expression that SSI Tharanal couldn't fully read, something calm and old and settled, like a deep-water current that moves slowly and cannot be stopped. "I've been ready for this conversation with the Dominion for a long time," she said quietly. "We all have." She paused. "Tell your ambassador that we'd appreciate it if the endless curiosity stayed close. Having a Thessari ship nearby when they arrive will help." "Help how?" SSI Tharanal asked. "It'll remind them," Vasquez said simply, "that this isn't just between us and them." SSI Tharanal wrote that down. Then she looked out the view screen at the pale blue, floating quiet against the stars, its running lights blinking in that strange, cheerful pattern that she had asked about and been told was called festive, for reasons the captain had explained, but that SSI Tharanal was still thinking about. She thought about Thissaranal's old record, about the line that the ambassador kept in her private archive. We're not going anywhere, we're just hard to find. She thought they had been found, but she was beginning to understand, slowly, the way understanding sometimes comes, that being found was not the same as being known, and that she had only just started to learn who these people really were. Outside, the stars were very still. Somewhere in the dark, moving without any visible hurry, 40 Vreth warships were on their way. The pale blue kept blinking its festive lights. SSI Theranil went to find Velasan and asked him to make her something warm to drink. She had a feeling it was going to be a long few days. Admiral Dunverk had been in the Vreth military for 37 years. He had fought in 4 wars, suppressed 11 rebellions, and once single-handedly turned a battle that everyone else had already decided was lost. He was not a man who doubted himself. He was not a man who wasted time on worry. He moved through the galaxy like a stone dropped from a great height, direct, certain, and very difficult to stop. He was also, though he would never have said this out loud, deeply uncomfortable with the assignment. Not because of the humans. He agreed with Vale Kreth entirely on that point. They were a story, a ghost, a thing people used when they needed something to be afraid of that wasn't real. No, what made him uncomfortable was the politics of it. Sending 40 warships to confront what was most likely one small research vessel, and a lot of embarrassing mythology felt like using a boulder to crack a seed. If the humans turned out to be nothing, and they almost certainly were nothing, he would have made the Dominion look ridiculous. But orders were orders. He had 42 ships under his command, the finest in the Dominion's outer fleet, and he had his instructions. Find them, evaluate the threat, remind them of how power worked. Simple enough. The fleet dropped out of FTL in a precise formation that Dunverk had drilled his captains on for years. A wide crescent, every ship in its place, weapons systems warm but not active. It was a posture that said, we are strong and we are here and you should make your decisions accordingly. He had used it many times. It worked. For a moment the view screen showed him exactly what he expected, empty space, a distant nebula, some unremarkable stars. Then the sensors gave him the 2 ships. One was the Endless Curiosity, a Thessari research vessel he had already pulled records on during the journey. The other was the human ship, the Pale Blue. He stared at it. He was not sure what he had expected, something more perhaps. It was smaller than he had imagined. It had no visible weapon systems. It was painted in gray, blue, and white, and along its hull, he zoomed the visual feed, there were lights. Small, colorful lights, blinking in a cheerful, rhythmic pattern that had absolutely no tactical significance whatsoever. One of his junior officers made a very quiet sound, not a laugh, something more confused than a laugh. "Open a channel," Dunverk said. Then, before his communications officer could respond, something came through on the channel on its own, not words but sound. A transmission from the human ship, on an open frequency. Music, his system identified it as. Loud, aggressive, fast, built around a rhythm that hit like a physical thing, and a voice that was shouting something about a road and a destination. It took his translator 7 full seconds to process the lyrics, which was longer than it usually took for anything. The translation it returned was, "I am traveling on a path toward extreme conditions, and I find this acceptable." Dunverk blinked. "Get me the human captain," he said. Captain Vasquez appeared on the screen. She was sitting in what appeared to be her command chair, relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, with a cup of something hot in her hand. She looked at him the way you might look at someone who has knocked on your door, politely attentive, in no particular hurry. "Admiral," she said. She said it correctly, which meant she had already looked up his rank. "Welcome to the Orion Spur. I'm Captain Elena Vasquez of the ISV Pale Blue. Can I help you?" "You are operating in unclaimed space with an unregistered vessel," Dunverk said. "Under Conclave Treaty 741, all unregistered vessels are subject to Dominion inspection in Treaty 741 applies to commercial vessels operating within map trade corridors, Vasquez said pleasantly. We're in uncharted space, and we're not a commercial vessel, but I appreciate the citation. Doenwerk paused. In 37 years, nobody had interrupted him mid-treaty citation. He recalibrated. You represent a species with no standing in the conclave, no registered territory, and no diplomatic recognition. You have made contact with a conclave member species, without authorization, and we made contact when a Thesari research vessel responded to a beacon that Thesari scientists placed in space 300 years ago, Vasquez said, still pleasantly. That seems more like them contacting us. She took a sip from her cup. I'm happy to discuss the formalities, but I want to make sure we're starting from accurate information. He looked at her. She looked at him. His 42 ships sat in their crescent formation around her one. The numbers were not ambiguous. Captain Vasquez, he said, deciding to get to the point, you are a single vessel in the presence of a Dominion fleet. I am prepared to offer you a simple and direct path forward. You will provide us with full technical data on your vessel and your species' current capabilities. You will submit to a Dominion escort to a neutral station for formal evaluation. And you will, in the meantime, power down all active systems and hold your position. There was a pause. And if we don't? Vasquez asked. She didn't say it like a challenge. She said it like a genuine question, the way someone asks what happens if you push this button, more curious than defiant. Then, Doenwerk said, I will take that as a hostile act. Vasquez looked at him for a moment, then she set down her cup. Admiral, I want to be honest with you because I think you're someone who respects straight talk. She leaned forward slightly. We've been watching Vreth military doctrine for about 200 years. We know how this conversation is supposed to go. You make a show of force, we're supposed to be scared, and then you get what you want. She paused. I'm not going to do that. Not because I'm being stubborn, but because I think there's a better conversation we could be having. Your opinion of what conversation we should be having is not relevant, Doenwerk said. Maybe not, Vasquez said. But before you make your next decision, Admiral, I'd like to show you something. For exactly 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then 6 ships decloaked. They appeared like a held breath suddenly released. One moment the space around the Vreth fleet was empty, and the next moment there were 6 vessels sitting in the gaps between his ships, close enough that his proximity alarms lit up like festival lights. Not outside the fleet, inside it, tucked into the formation as if they had been there the whole time, which his suddenly screaming sensor logs were informing him they had. His weapons officers reacted immediately, targeting systems locking on. His hand was already moving toward the command to fire. They're not warships, Vasquez said, very calmly into the open channel. He stopped. He looked at the sensor data. She was right. The 6 vessels were larger than the Pale Blue, but their configuration was wrong for combat. No weapon ports. Heavy shielding, yes, but the hull design was built for cargo and crew capacity, not firepower. They were, his analyst reported after a long, confused moment, logistics carriers, supply ships. The kind of vessels that followed a military fleet to keep it fed and fueled and repaired. Support ships had been sitting inside his combat formation for an unknown amount of time, and his sensors had not detected them once. Nobody in his fleet had. The bridge of the Vreth flagship was very quiet. Doenwerk found that he needed to breathe slowly and deliberately, which was not normally something he had to think about. Those are our support ships, Vasquez said. They're not armed. I sent them in ahead of time because I wanted you to understand something. Her voice was still calm and still even and still somehow not unkind. We're not the Pale Blue. The Pale Blue is just who came to talk, and those 6 ships, those are just the ones that keep the lights on. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had something very quiet and very serious under it. We didn't bring our warships, Admiral. We didn't think we'd need them. But if you want, I can have some here in about 4 hours. Doenwerk said nothing. He was thinking very quickly about what kind of fleet would bring logistics vessels to a first contact situation, not as a show of force, but as a demonstration, about what it meant that those 6 ships had sat inside his formation, invisible for the entire approach, about what it meant that they had planned for this conversation far enough in advance to stage it. He was thinking about what kind of military does not bring its warships to this conversation, because it does not think it needs them. He was, and he identified the feeling slowly, because it was genuinely unfamiliar, afraid. Not of the ships, not even of the warships that might be 4 hours away. He was afraid because for the first time in 37 years, he was in a room, a situation, and he did not know how big it actually was. He could see the walls he could see. He had no idea what was behind the ones he couldn't. Admiral, it was his second-in-command, Commander Drevathel, speaking quietly at his shoulder. Your orders. Doenwerk looked at the screen. Vasquez was watching him with patient, steady eyes. She was still not afraid. She had been not afraid the entire time, and he was beginning to understand that it was not an act. He thought about the message he would have to send to Vale Creth. He thought about what it would say. We arrived. We made our demands. They were not afraid. They had ships we couldn't see. I am not sure how many we still cannot see. He thought about the fact that the Conclave broadcast network was, almost certainly, receiving some portion of this transmission. The Thessari ship was right there, and the Thessari were not known for keeping quiet when something important happened. Hold position, he said. Stand down targeting. He kept his voice perfectly level. We will return to Dominion space to report and await further instructions. On the screen, Vasquez nodded once. I think that's a good idea, she said. For what it's worth, Admiral, the offer to talk is open. It will stay open. We've waited 300 years already. We're not in a rush. He cut the channel. The bridge was silent for a long moment. She said 4 hours, his analyst said carefully, for warships. I heard her, Doenwerk said. Do you think that's accurate? Doenwerk looked at the empty space where the 6 cloaked ships had been sitting, completely invisible for the entire time. He thought about the answer. He thought about how, an hour ago, he would have said that none of this was real. Yes, he said quietly, I think it is accurate. He turned away from the screen and began composing his report to the High Council. It was going to be a difficult message to write. He had delivered bad news before, many times, but this was different. This was not bad news. This was a new kind of news entirely, the kind that changed the shape of things, the kind that, once received, could not be unreceived. He started with the only sentence that felt honest. They are real, and I believe we have made a significant mistake in our assumptions. Outside, the Vreth fleet began its quiet, orderly retreat. Behind them, the pale blue floated in the dark, its small festive lights still blinking, patient and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. Which, it was becoming increasingly clear to everyone who had been watching, it did. The recording of Admiral Doenwerk's retreat was, as SSI Theranol had expected, broadcast across the Conclave network within hours of it happening. She had not been the one who leaked it. She would not confirm whether she knew who did. What she would say, later, in her official account, was that the recording spread the way things spread when an entire galaxy has been waiting for something without knowing it, fast and far, and with a kind of released energy that felt almost physical. Every species watched it. Most of them watched it more than once. The 6 ships decloaking inside the Vreth formation became the most replayed moment in Conclave broadcast history. Analysts on 100 worlds watched it frame by frame, trying to understand how those ships had stayed invisible to 42 Vreth sensor arrays. They had no answer. The technology simply did not match anything in any database. The Thessari watched the recording quietly, with great dignity, and then went to their private rooms and made sounds that were the equivalent of very excited laughter. The Vreth Dominion issued a formal statement through the conclave that used the words unprovoked provocation and deliberate intimidation, an act of aggression. Most species read those words and then watched the recording again and found the statement difficult to take seriously. Vale Creth did not find it difficult to take seriously. He found it enraging. He called the High Council together 3 days after Duneverk's fleet returned to Dominion space. The council chamber was sealed. No outside observers. No broadcasts. "They humiliated us," he said. He did not shout. Vale Creth almost never shouted. His anger was a cold thing, controlled, like a weapon kept carefully in its case. In front of the entire conclave, a species we dismissed as mythology just demonstrated to every watching eye that our fleet is blind. "To their cloaking technology," said Council Member Drevkal, who was old and careful and usually right. "Not to conventional vessels." "Not to conventional vessels." Vale Creth repeated the phrase as if it tasted bad. "And if they have unconventional ones?" Nobody answered. "They are playing a game," Vale Creth said. "They want us to believe they are powerful. They want us to hesitate. That is what the cloaked ships were about, not combat capability but theater. A message." He looked around the table. "We do not respond to messages by sitting quietly. We respond with the Grand Armada." Drevkal said, carefully, "The Grand Armada has not been deployed in full since the Second Border War." "Correct," said Vale Creth. "Which means every species in the conclave will understand exactly what it means when we do." He pressed a panel on the table in front of him. A display rose from the center of the room, a star map, with a single blue-white star marked in the center. "That," he said, "is Sol, the human's home star." He looked at his council. "We are going to go there, all 812 ships. We are going to arrive at their home, and we are going to remind them and every watching galaxy that mythology does not win wars." The vote was taken. The decision was made. The Grand Armada began to mobilize. The conclave heard about it within 48 hours. Several species filed formal protests. Several others quietly began moving their border stations to less exposed positions. The Alun sent a private message to the Thesari that simply said this is going to be very bad or very interesting, and we cannot tell which. SSI Theranal, still aboard the Endless Curiosity near the Orion Spur, received a transmission from Captain Vasquez the morning after the mobilization news broke. Vasquez looked, SSI Theranal thought, exactly like she had looked at every other point in this situation. Calm, alert, not afraid. "You've seen the news," Vasquez said. 812 ships, SSI Theranal confirmed. "Heading for Sol, for Earth." She paused. "Captain, I want to ask you something directly and I would like a direct answer." "Go ahead." "Are you prepared for this?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Not a hesitant quiet, a thoughtful one. "SSI Theranal," she said finally, "we have been watching the Vreth Dominion for 200 years. We have been watching their fleet movements, their deployment patterns, their logistics chains, their communication protocols. We have been watching their supply routes and their refueling stations and the specific schedules their maintenance crews keep." She paused. "We did not watch all of that so that we could be surprised by it." "That doesn't fully answer my question," SSI Theranal said. Vasquez smiled, and it was a different kind of smile than the earlier ones, quieter with something behind it. "We're prepared," she said. "That is the direct answer." What happened over the next 2 weeks was not witnessed in real time by most of the conclave. It was pieced together afterward, from sensor logs and intercepted communications, and the accounts of the few neutral observers who happened to be in the right places. The first strange things began in Vreth Dominion space, before the Armada had even crossed the border. A supply depot near the Kersh system went offline. Its communications didn't stop. They just started saying strange things, reporting routine operations, while its actual output quietly fell to nothing. It was 3 days before anyone in the Dominion command structure noticed. Then a chain of communication relays in the outer Dominion territories began dropping, one by one, at intervals just long enough that each failure looked like a technical problem rather than a pattern. 3 Armada fuel carriers, traveling ahead of the main fleet to pre-position supplies along the route to Saul, simply stopped responding. They were found later, intact, crew unharmed, floating in the dark with their engines completely non-functional, and every single fuel reserve drained, not stolen, not vented, just transferred somewhere else through methods the engineers who inspected them could not initially explain. The Armada kept moving, but it was moving differently than it had been planned to, slower, rerouting around gaps, burning through reserves faster than expected. The careful, precise machine of Vreth military logistics was beginning to develop small, quiet holes. And nobody in the Vreth command structure could see the hands that were making them. The Grand Armada crossed into the Sol system on a morning that the crew of the Endless Curiosity, now repositioned at a safe observation distance, would remember for the rest of their lives. 812 ships. They came in formation, massive and dark and very real, the largest military force anyone in the Conclave had ever assembled. Even on the Endless Curiosity's long-range sensors, they were an extraordinary sight, a vast crescent of metal and power, moving with the slow certainty of something that has never had to hurry because nothing has ever been fast enough to stop it. SSI Theranol stood at the viewscreen and felt something that she supposed was fear, and also something she couldn't quite name, a breathless, suspended feeling, like the moment before something long expected finally arrives. "Captain Vasquez," she said into the open channel, "the Armada is at the edge of the Sol system." "I see them," Vasquez said. She was not on the pale blue anymore. She was somewhere else, she had been vague about where, and her voice on the channel was steady and quiet. "Where is the human fleet?" SSI Theranol asked. "I'm not seeing." Then she stopped. On the long-range sensors, from behind the far side of Earth's moon, something was moving. Not one ship, not 6, a fleet, rising from the shadow of the moon with the slow, unhurried confidence of something that has been waiting a long time and is now, finally, done waiting. SSI Theranol had studied military vessels her entire career. She knew their shapes and sizes and configurations. She knew what a warship looked like, the angles built for deflecting fire, the reinforced hull sections, the weapon ports designed to be hard to spot from certain angles until they needed to be seen. The human warships were beautiful. That was not a word she used professionally, but it was the one that arrived in her mind and stayed there. They were large, larger than she had expected, and they moved with a smoothness that suggested the most extraordinary engineering, and they were built with an intent so clear and so total that even looking at them from a distance she could feel it. These ships had been built to win. In the Vreth Armada's command ship, Veilkreth watched the human fleet emerge and felt something he had told himself he would not feel. The sensors were giving him numbers. He focused on the numbers because numbers were real and useful. Human fleet, approximately 300 vessels. Armada, 812. The numbers were in his favor. He kept watching the human fleet moving toward his Armada and found, unexpectedly, that the numbers did not make him feel better. He opened a channel. "Human vessels, you are facing the full Grand Armada of the Vreth Dominion. Stand down and withdraw, or we will." "High Commander Veilkreth," a voice said from the channel. It was not Vasquez. It was a different voice, a man's voice, older, with the particular calmness of someone who has spent a great deal of time in difficult situations. "My name is Admiral James Okoro. I command the Sol Defense Fleet." A brief pause. "I want to make sure we understand each other clearly before anything else happens. We are not going to stand down, we are not going to withdraw, and we are not going to fire first." Another pause, shorter. "But we will respond. And I want you to have seen that clearly so there's no confusion later about what happened here." Veilkreth said, "Your fleet is outnumbered nearly 3 to 1. Yes, said Okoro, I'm aware. The first engagement lasted 11 minutes. Later, analysts from 6 different species would spend years studying the sensor records of those 11 minutes, trying to fully understand what happened. The human fleet did not fight the way any known species fought. They did not charge or form lines or try to concentrate fire on single targets. They moved in a fluid, shifting pattern that seemed almost random until you watched it long enough to see that it was not random at all. It was adaptive, every ship constantly adjusting to every other ship, the whole fleet moving like something alive. They did not fire to destroy. Every human weapon system was calibrated with extraordinary precision to disable. Engines, navigation systems, weapons arrays. The shots were targeted with a surgical accuracy that the Vreth gunners, trying to track and match, could not come close to answering. In 11 minutes, 240 Vreth ships were dead in space. Not destroyed, not burning, just stopped. Every crew intact, every vessel recoverable, just entirely, completely unable to move. The rest of the armada held its formation. It had not broken. The Vreth were not a species that broke easily, but Vale-Creth could see his captains waiting for his orders, and he could feel in the silence of the channel, in the stillness of his officers around him, that the next move was the most important decision he had ever made. Okoro's voice came back on the channel. High Commander, I want you to look at the ships we've disabled, check your sensors, check your crew reports. A pause. Everyone is alive, every ship is intact. We can give you your 240 ships back in about 3 days with a repair team. His voice was quiet and utterly serious. We don't want a war. We have never wanted a war, but you should understand something clearly. We are very, very good at them. Another pause. Stand the armada down. Let's talk. Vale-Creth looked at the disabled ships on his sensor display. He looked at the human fleet, sitting calm and still in the space ahead of him, not advancing, waiting. He thought about Duneverk's report, about the cloaked logistics ships, about the supply depot that had gone dark before the armada even crossed the border, about the fuel carriers floating empty in the dark. About 240 ships stopped cold in 11 minutes without a single casualty. He thought about the word he had used in the conclave chamber, confident and contemptuous. Story. He closed his eyes for a moment. Stand down the armada, he said. All vessels hold position, do not fire. He opened his eyes. Open a channel to the human admiral. The channel opened. Admiral Okoro, Vale-Creth said. I am listening. Captain Elena Vasquez was sitting in a small office on Varathsul Station, drinking coffee and watching the live conclave broadcast on a screen that was slightly too large for the desk it sat on, when Ambassador Dr. Amara Os walked to the podium and the grand chamber went quiet. Vasquez had been in many important rooms in her career. She had stood on the bridge of a ship facing down 40 Vreth warships. She had sat across from alien species and tried to explain the concept of jazz. She had watched her own fleet disable 240 enemy vessels in 11 minutes without losing a single crew member. She had done hard things with a calm face more times than she could count. But watching Amara walk to that podium, in a chamber that held representatives from over 200 species who had once believed humans were a bedtime story, that made her hands tight around her cup in a way she hadn't expected. She took a breath. She watched. Dr. Amara Osai was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years as a historian. She had studied the conclave long before humanity had officially reintroduced itself to it. She had read every intercepted communication, every political record, every cultural document that Earth's listening network had gathered over 3 centuries. She knew this room better than most of the people in it knew it. She had studied its history, its failures, its moments of extraordinary decency, and its long, complicated story of power and compromise. She was not nervous. Nervous was not the right word. She was present, fully, carefully present, the way you are when something matters and you know it. She stood at the podium for a moment before speaking. She looked at the room, at the hundreds of species looking back at her. At the Thessari delegation, where Ambassador Ssion sat with her mandibles perfectly still. At the Vreth section, where the seats were not empty because Veilcreth had come, and that mattered. At the smaller delegations in the upper tiers, species whose names most of the galaxy barely knew, watching with quiet, careful eyes. "My name is Dr. Amara Osei," she said. "I am the first formal ambassador of the United Earth Council to the Galactic Conclave." She paused. "And I want to start by saying something that I know might seem unusual for a diplomatic address." The chamber waited. "I want to say that we are sorry for the silence." In the small office, Vasquez set down her cup. "Not for hiding," Amara continued. "I won't apologize for protecting our people during a time when we didn't yet know if this galaxy was safe for us. That was a decision made carefully, and I believe it was right." She looked out at the chamber. "But 300 years is a long time to be absent, and in that time, things happened that we watched from a distance that we might have helped with if we had been here. Conflicts we might have helped resolve. Species that suffered under arrangements that more voices at the table might have changed." She paused, letting that settle. "We made a choice, and it was a reasonable choice, and it still cost something. I think it's important to say that plainly." The chamber was very quiet. "We are not here," she went on, "because we are the most powerful species in this room. I am aware that the events of the last several weeks have made our military capabilities very clear, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But power is not why we are asking for a seat at this table." She looked across the room slowly, making sure she was speaking to all of it. "We are here because we are curious. Because 300 years of watching you, all of you, has made us want to be part of this, not just observers of it. Because we have made mistakes, as all of you have, and we have learned things, as all of you have, and we think we have something to contribute." She smiled, and it was a small, honest smile, not political, not calculated. "We also think you are all extraordinary," she said. "Every species in this room. We have spent 3 centuries studying you, and we are still not finished. We expect we never will be. That is, honestly, one of the best things we can say about you." The vote that followed was not, as SSI Theranil noted in her official report, a foregone conclusion. The Vreth Dominion abstained rather than voting yes. Veilcreth's delegation sat in silence while the count was read, and he did not look at the human section when the final number came up. But he had come. He had stayed. He had listened. After the ceasefire in the Sol system, he had returned to Dominion space and within a week requested a private channel with Admiral Okoro, not to negotiate surrender terms but to ask questions. Specific, careful questions about how the human fleet had managed what it managed. Okoro had answered them, all of them, clearly and without gloating. Veilcreth had not said thank you because that was not how Vreth operated, but he had said I understand, and from him in that moment, that meant the same thing. The Dominion itself was not unified. The ceasefire had cracked something that had already been cracking for a long time, not the Vreth people, but the system around them, the structure of authority that Veilcreth and the High Council represented. 3 client species at the Dominion's edge, smaller peoples who had been under Vreth authority for decades without much choice, sent quiet communications to the Conclave and to the new human delegation within days of the Sol system stand-up. They asked, carefully and with great dignity, whether there were options they had not previously known about. It was Vasquez who handled those first conversations, not because she was the senior diplomat, that was Amara's role, but because she had been the first face most of the galaxy had associated with humanity, and because she had a way of sitting across from someone in a difficult situation and making them feel like the conversation was going somewhere good. She told the 3 species, in 3 separate conversations, the same thing, that options existed, that the Conclave had mechanisms for exactly this kind of situation, and that the human delegation would support them in whatever direction they chose. She did not promise easy outcomes. She told them the truth about how complicated these processes were. All three species said they understood. All three said they wanted to proceed. Vale Kreth found out about those conversations within 2 days, because the Vreth had an excellent intelligence network. He sent a formal communication to the human delegation that was pointed and cold, and used the word interference several times. Vasquez wrote back, in a response that was almost equally formal but had something at the edges of it that was not cold at all. She wrote that humanity was not trying to destabilize the Dominion. She wrote that a Vreth Dominion that was stable, confident, and at peace with its neighbors was better for the whole galaxy, including Earth. She wrote that they had no interest in the Dominion's collapse, but also that they would always engage honestly with any species that asked for help. Then she wrote one more line that was not in the official diplomatic phrasing. "You came to the table when it mattered, High Commander. That is not nothing." He did not respond to that line specifically, but the tone of the next communication from the Dominion was slightly different. Not warm, the Vreth were not warm, but different in the way that a door left slightly open is different from a door that is locked. The months that followed were complicated in the way that most important things are complicated. Earth's formal entry into the conclave was not a smooth, simple event. There were arguments about territory, about the legal status of the listening network, about what 3 centuries of observation meant for the rights and expectations of the species who had been observed. There were species that were genuinely afraid of humanity, not of their military, but of the knowledge they had, of what it meant to be studied so long and so carefully without knowing it. Amara handled most of those conversations herself. She was honest in them, which was not always comfortable, but comfort was not what those species needed. They needed to trust, and trust required honesty first. SSI Theranal published her xenobiological account of first contact 6 months after the Sol system stand-down. It was the most widely read document in Conclave history within 2 weeks of its release. The section that was most discussed was not about military capability or political strategy. It was a small section near the end, almost a footnote, in which she described Captain Vasquez sitting in a virtual meeting room, holding an empty coffee cup with the absent mild disappointment of someone who had hoped it would last a little longer. They are, SSI Theranal wrote in the end, very much like everyone else. They worry, they hope, they get tired, they make jokes at moments when other species would be silent, they form attachments quickly and keep them carefully. They feel things deeply and often try not to show it, which they are not as good at hiding as they believe. What is different about them is not that they are stronger or smarter or more advanced. What is different is something harder to name. The best word I have found after months of observation is this. They believe, with a completeness I have not encountered in any other species, that things can be better, not as a hope, not as a wish, as a working assumption they carry everywhere they go. It is, I think, the most quietly remarkable thing about them. On a Tuesday morning, Earth still kept its own calendar, and Tuesday was one of the words the translators had simply borrowed whole. Vasquez sat on a bench outside the conclave's observation garden, which was a large pressurized space full of plants from 40 different worlds that had been given as gifts over the centuries, and now grew together in a beautiful, slightly chaotic tangle that no one had planned but everyone liked. SSI Theranal found her there and sat beside her. They did not talk for a while. They looked at the garden. "How are you?" SSI Theranal asked eventually. "Tired," Vasquez said. "Good tired, the kind that means something happened." SSI Theranal clicked her mandibles once, the soft click that meant yes, I understand. "He voted to abstain," Vasquez said. She didn't need to say the name. "I know," SSI Theranal said. "Is that what you wanted?" "An abstention is better than a no," Vasquez said. "A no is a wall, an abstention is a door." She paused. "We can work with a door." SSI Theranal looked at her. You are a great deal of work as a species, she said. Vasquez laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and surprised, and it startled a small plant near the bench that rustled its leaves in response. Yeah, she said. We've been told. In the grand chamber, in the Vreth Observer's gallery, Vale Creth sat alone after the session and looked at the now empty podium where Dr. Amara Osai had stood. He thought about what she had said, about the silence, about the apology she had offered and the clarity with which she had offered it, without begging, without shame, simply as an honest accounting. He thought about 37 years of military service, and about all the stories he had dismissed, and about sitting in a fleet of 42 ships while 6 invisible vessels decloaked inside his formation like a quiet answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He thought about the word he had used, story. He thought about what it meant that the story had arrived, and had arrived like this, not with rage, not with revenge, not with a crushing display of all the power it had accumulated over 3 centuries of watching and waiting, but with a historian at a podium telling the truth. He did not know yet what the Dominion would do. The High Council was already arguing, and that argument would take a long time to resolve, and it might resolve badly. He was not optimistic by nature. But he was, he found, not certain it would resolve badly. And uncertainty, in a life built on certainty, felt strange. It felt, if he was completely honest with himself, like something had opened that he had not known was closed. He looked at the empty podium for a long time. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked out of the chamber, not toward the ships, not toward the Dominion's secure communications array, but toward the small corridor that led to the conclave's public meeting rooms, where he had been told, through channels that required a certain amount of personal humility to use, that the human delegation was available for conversations. He walked slowly. He was not sure what he would say. He would think of something. Outside, through the station's viewing panels, the stars were the same stars they had always been. Steady, quiet, full of things that had always been there even when no one was looking. And somewhere among them, patient and unhurried and deeply, irreducibly itself, a species that the galaxy had once called a story was sitting down at the table, and finally, after 300 years, beginning to talk.